The burner phone tucked beneath my suitcase lining wasn't mine. Nathan planted it. In 1 second, the arithmetic of our marriage calculated to 0. He was framing me for his laundering scheme. I didn't panic. When his deputy Sienna turned away, I slipped the phone and the incriminating flash drive into her carry-on. Sienna was too preoccupied with inflating her own importance to Nathan's inner circle to ever suspect that I, the invisible wife, would be the one to play her. We headed toward the TSA gate. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I watched from 30 feet away as the security line ground to a sudden, mechanical halt. The conveyor belt stopped its endless loop. A TSA agent pointed at the X-ray monitor, his finger tapping the glass, then gestured directly at Sienna's designer tote bag. Nathan stood just past the metal detector, adjusting his cuffs. He was entirely confident. He was waiting for the exact moment they pulled my bag aside. I could see the faint, arrogant smirk playing on his lips, the expression he always wore when he executed a flawless acquisition. This wasn't revenge. It was a simple reassignment of assets. He watched the security screen, fully expecting to see my downfall broadcast in high definition. Instead, the federal officer unzipped Sienna's bag and extracted the exact black device Nathan had hidden in my luggage just an hour prior. The TSA agent flagged it as an unauthorized electronic component during a secondary screening, which triggered a standard protocol call to the airport police, who handle cybersecurity matters. The shift in his posture was instantaneous and absolute. His signature smirk dissolved into pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at the phone, then at Sienna, whose face had completely drained of all color. She stammered, stepping back, looking to him for a lifeline he could no longer provide. I didn't feel a surge of malicious glee. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was entirely clinical. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and I was simply auditing the results. I picked up my cleared suitcase from the belt. Nathan's eyes darted through the crowded checkpoint and locked onto mine. He expected me to be bewildered. He expected me to be the frantic, confused wife he could easily manipulate into taking the fall. Instead, he saw a woman whose pulse was perfectly steady. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. I walked right past him. I didn't stop, I didn't offer a supportive hand, and I didn't ask what was going on. I merely adjusted the strap of my leather bag and proceeded toward our departure gate. Behind me, the voices of the security officers grew sharper, demanding answers about the encrypted device. Nathan stammered, his usual corporate polish shattering under the weight of federal scrutiny. I left him there to explain his own trap to the authorities. The ledger was finally being balanced, and for the first time in our marriage, I wasn't the one footing the bill. Sitting at the departure gate, listening to the final boarding calls, I didn't look back toward the security checkpoint. I simply opened my laptop and began auditing the last 7 years of my life. I had been the silent investor in their version of family. From our cramped shared home office, I had drafted the intricate branding strategies that built his tech startup from the ground up. I wrote the initial pitch decks, I analyzed the complex market trends. Nathan took those pristine strategies into boardrooms and presented them as his own unassisted genius. I let him take the credit because I believed we were building a shared enterprise. I thought my invisible labor was a secure deposit into our joint future. He had told me we were sacrificing our present comforts to secure our tomorrow. According to his spreadsheets, we had saved $4.2 million. It was a massive nest egg built on my endless hours of uncredited, uncompensated work. But love had never been a partnership for him. Now I realized it had been a subscription, with me unknowingly footing the bill. He had systematically conditioned me to accept less, to feel smaller so his ego could appear exponentially larger. This is the insidious trap of normalizing cruelty. It doesn't happen overnight with a single dramatic event. It is a slow, methodical erosion of your baseline for acceptable behavior. First, they casually dismiss your ideas in a meeting. Then, they claim your hard-won victories as their own. When you object, you are calmly told you are overreacting, that you simply misunderstand the corporate dynamic of your relationship. Over time, your brain recalibrates just to survive the toxic environment. You stop expecting basic reciprocity. You begin to accept a severe imbalance as the standard operating procedure, convincing yourself that this quiet suffering is just the cost of being a supportive partner. You mistake your own subjugation for loyalty. I looked at the data files on my screen. The numbers didn't lie. The $4.2 million wasn't a shared future. It was a carefully constructed mirage. He hadn't just stolen my intellectual property. He had stolen my reality, replacing it with a narrative where I was nothing more than a disposable resource. I didn't cry. I didn't ask the empty terminal why this was happening. I just highlighted the relevant data points and started preparing my next strategic move. My mind was sharp, evaluating the parameters of my exit. I closed the laptop as my boarding group was called. Nathan barely made the flight. He slid into the first-class seat beside me just seconds before the cabin doors closed, sweating profusely and breathing hard. Sienna had been detained by the authorities. He immediately went to work trying to regain his lost control. He leaned in close, his voice adopting that low, patronizing cadence he's strictly reserved for hostile boardroom disputes and our domestic arguments. He told me I was stressed. He told me I was completely delusional to think he had anything to do with what had just transpired at the security checkpoint. He was running the classic gaslighting script, attempting to provoke a severe emotional reaction. He wanted me to scream, to cry, to make an embarrassing scene so he could point to my instability and validate his own twisted narrative to the flight attendants and passengers. But I maintained an eerie, calculated calmness. I didn't raise my voice by a single decibel. I didn't engage with his manufactured chaos. I simply looked at him as if he were a poorly performing asset that was about to be liquidated. Yet, beneath that cold clinical exterior, a fierce internal battle raged. A part of me, the deeply ingrained part that had spent years investing emotional capital into this marriage, fought the urge to trust him one last time. This is the heavy psychological toll of cognitive dissonance in the corporate spouse. When your entire life is structurally entwined with someone who projects an image of perfect authority and competence to the outside world, recognizing their deceit creates a severe psychological crisis. Your brain desperately tries to reconcile the charming, successful tech founder everyone admires with the manipulative predator sitting directly beside you. To survive the immense cognitive friction, your mind often defaults to self-doubt. It tries to protect you from the shattering realization that the fundamental foundation of your life is an absolute lie. But the encrypted data resting on my hard drive anchored me to reality. The facts were immutable and immune to his charm. The planted burner phone, the hidden offshore accounts, the missing $4.2 million. I felt the cognitive dissonance snap, completely replaced by a cold, absolute certainty. I didn't argue with his desperate lies. I just let them hang in the pressurized cabin air, watching him sweat as his usual manipulative tactics failed to land. He wasn't shocking me with his deception anymore. He was just providing more verbal evidence for my final report. I turned my attention back to the window, treating his frantic whispers like irrelevant background noise on a busy trading floor. The moment we landed in Seattle, our trajectories permanently split. Nathan rushed off to his tech conference, desperate to maintain his crumbling facade of control, while I executed the next critical phase of my restructuring. I took a cab to a secure, unassuming coffee shop tucked away in the financial district. Waiting for me at a quiet corner table was a forensic accountant I had retained days ago, back when my initial suspicions first began to solidify into hard facts. I slid into the booth and opened my laptop. There were no tears shed over the lattes. There were no dramatic declarations of heartbreak or betrayal. I simply handed over the heavily encrypted drives I had secured before the airport incident. I had pulled the real financial logs, completely bypassing the sanitized ledgers Nathan had left on the home server for me to manage. I had long anticipated a day like this. Years ago, I'd subtly mirrored his admin privileges onto a personal drive, just in case our joint enterprise ever hit a structural failure. We sat in silence for 2 solid hours, meticulously cross-referencing server logs, offshore transfer receipts, and the complex labyrinth of shell companies Nathan had constructed to hide his tracks. My retaliation was entirely professional. I was treating Nathan's career and our marriage exactly the same way, as a series of corrupted data points waiting to be permanently erased. Anger is highly inefficient. It clouds your judgment and slows your reaction time. Clarity, however, is lethal. I reviewed the digital flow of the missing $4.2 million with the strict attachment of an independent auditor performing a hostile takeover. The forensic expert showed me the exact digital footprints Nathan had failed to cover. He had been incredibly sloppy, arrogant enough to believe I would never look past the strict boundaries he had set for me. He thought I was just the supportive wife, the quiet marketing analyst who would dutifully manage the domestic front while he played the untouchable corporate titan. He completely forgot that I was the one who built his initial financial models. I knew the architecture of his systems better than he did. I didn't ask the accountant for sympathy or a shoulder to cry on. I asked for verifiable proof. I asked for documented evidence that would stand up to rigorous federal scrutiny. We compiled a digital dossier so airtight it left absolutely no room for interpretation or negotiation. I was systematically dismantling his life's work, row by row, cell by cell on the spreadsheet. This wasn't an act of revenge. It was a necessary accounting adjustment. I paid the expert in full, took the physical copies of the forensic reports, and stepped out into the damp, grey Seattle air. The data-gathering transaction was complete. Back in my quiet hotel room, I reviewed the final printed dossier. It was during this final audit that I found the absolute kill shot. The ultimate betrayal wasn't the financial lies or the attempt to frame me at the airport. It was a single, heavily buried tax document hidden deep within the offshore records. Nathan wasn't just laundering startup money. He had meticulously forged my signature on federal tax documents, legally naming me as the sole owner and primary director of his largest shell company. He gambled on the fact that as his wife, I was so conditioned to supportive silence that even when faced with the evidence, I would be too terrified of the joint tax liability to ever report him to the IRS. He thought he had me cornered by the very laws designed to protect spouses. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, followed immediately by absolute, freezing clarity. The missing $4.2 million wasn't just hidden away, it was pinned directly and legally to my name. He had engineered the entire financial structure to ensure that when the massive shortfall was inevitably discovered, the federal liability would completely bypass him and land squarely on my shoulders. I sat at the desk and pieced the full timeline together. The burner phone placed in my luggage, the incriminating flash drive, the perfectly timed business trip to Seattle. He hadn't just intended to leave me with nothing. He had actively intended for me to be arrested during this very conference. He was going to watch me get dragged out of the convention center by federal agents, playing the role of the shocked, innocent husband while I took the catastrophic fall for his corporate crimes. He was going to use my sudden incarceration as his perfect exit strategy. He would keep the stolen funds, maintain his pristine industry reputation, and likely keep Sienna, all while I spent the next 2 decades rotting in a federal prison. I had been the silent investor, and he had intended to bankrupt my entire life to save his own skin. I didn't break down. The sheer, calculated magnitude of his malice eradicated any remaining trace of affection or hesitation I might have harbored. I sat perfectly still, reviewing the forged signatures. They were convincing, but they were his. The forensic accountant had already flagged the digital timestamps, proving the fraudulent documents were generated directly from Nathan's personal terminal. I meticulously organized the evidence into a pristine black folder. I was no longer a wife dealing with a cheating husband. I was a liability expert, neutralizing a critical threat. The game board was fully illuminated, and I held all the winning pieces. I waited for him in the expansive lobby of the Grand Hotel where his conference was being held. I was dressed perfectly, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that projected absolute authority and calm. My posture was straight, my breathing perfectly even. Resting on my lap was the thick black folder containing the entirety of his destruction. Nathan burst through the revolving glass doors 20 minutes later. He was frantic, his expensive tie loosened, his hair wildly disheveled. The polished tech founder was completely gone, replaced by a desperate man realizing his perfectly laid traps had snapped shut on his own ankles. He scanned the crowded lobby, his eyes wild and darting, until they locked onto me, sitting calmly by the fireplace. He marched over, attempting to summon his usual aggressive dominance, but his hands were visibly shaking. "Claire," he hissed, glancing nervously at the other hotel guests. What is going on? Sienna has been detained. My primary accounts are completely frozen. What did you do? I didn't stand up. I simply looked at him, clinically evaluating the panic sweating from his pores. I didn't do anything, Nathan, I said, my voice incredibly calm and perfectly modulated. I just stopped correcting your math. I picked up the black folder and extended it toward him. He took it hesitantly, his fingers trembling as he flipped it open. I watched his eyes frantically track over the documents, the real financial logs, the offshore transfer receipts, and finally, the digital timestamps proving he had forged my signature to frame me for the missing $4.2 million. All the remaining blood drained from his face. You weren't shocked by what you'd done, I told him, holding his terrified gaze without blinking. You were just shocked that I stopped playing along. He opened his mouth to speak, to lie, to try and negotiate a surrender, but I raised a single hand to silence him. I had spent the last 48 hours proactively feeding the forensic report to the field office's white-collar crime division. They weren't here by coincidence. They were here by my invitation. They had been building a case against him for months. My dossier was simply the final, missing piece they needed to execute the warrant. Through the heavy glass doors of the lobby, I saw the flashing red and blue lights of 3 black SUVs pulling into the circular drive. Federal agents stepped out, their expressions grim, professional, and deeply purposeful. This is the profound power of the art of the quiet exit. In a culture that heavily glorifies the explosive confrontation, the loud screaming match, the dramatic throwing of drinks, true power lies in the absolute refusal to perform. Engaging in a public brawl validates the other person's inflated sense of importance. It signals that they still have the power to disrupt your emotional baseline. Walking away quietly, however, is the ultimate assertion of total dominance. It is treating a toxic adversary not as a formidable opponent, but as an irrelevant obstacle that you simply step around. You do not owe an explanation or a screaming match to someone who has dedicated themselves to manipulating you. You simply close the account, revoke their access to your energy, and exit the building, leaving them to completely collapse under the weight of their own unmanaged chaos. True power is knowing exactly when a fight is beneath you. This wasn't revenge, Nathan, I said softly as the federal agents entered the lobby and began speaking to the concierge, who pointed directly in our direction. Sienna had already been processed in a holding room nearby, her cooperation secured before Nathan even arrived. It was accounting. I stood up, smoothed the front of my tailored jacket, and walked past him. I didn't look back as the agents approached him. I didn't listen to his stammering, pathetic excuses as the agents calmly placed him in restraints and escorted him toward the service elevator to avoid a scene. I walked out the side exit into the crisp, cool Seattle evening. The damp air tasted incredibly clean. I've come to realize that surviving a betrayal of this magnitude changes the fundamental architecture of your soul. For a long time, I thought I needed to completely destroy him to heal myself. But standing in the cool air that night, listening to the sirens fade into the distance, I understood something much deeper. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes, it's the only way to set yourself free. I don't forgive him for what he did, but I deeply forgive myself for ever believing in him. I chose to release the anger because holding on to it would only keep me tethered to his ghost. My victory wasn't seeing him in handcuffs. My victory was waking up the next morning and realizing my life was entirely, unconditionally mine again. If you've ever had to walk away from someone who didn't deserve you, share your story in the comments. Let's build a community of people who choose their own peace.